Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up for someone when the whole world has turned against them. Sometimes love finds you in the most impossible places, when you're willing to risk everything for what's right. Eli Granger was a giant of a man sitting in chains, falsely accused and heading to prison. The whole town mocked him, certain he'd die on the brutal journey. Clara Mayfield was a quiet schoolteacher who lived by the rules. But when she heard the guards planning to let Eli rot without a fair trial, she couldn't stay silent. The next day, Clara rode out with just a rifle and courage no one knew she had. She freed the cowboy, and together they ran from men who wanted them both dead. What started as doing the right thing became something neither expected. But what price would they pay when Eli's past caught up with them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Dakota Territory sun burned high and unforgiving that August morning in 1882, casting harsh shadows across the dusty main street of Millfield. Clara Mayfield pressed her mother's worn leather Bible closer to her chest as she climbed the wooden steps to the one-room schoolhouse, the same path she'd walked every day for the past 3 years. The book had been her mother's most treasured possession, filled with pressed wildflowers between its pages and notes written in fading ink about faith, courage, and doing what's right, even when the world stands against you. At 28, Clara had resigned herself to the quiet rhythms of a spinster's life. She woke before dawn, prepared lessons by lamplight, taught the handful of children whose parents valued education over extra hands for farm work, and returned each evening to her small room above the general store. The routine had become her shelter against loneliness, a predictable pattern that asked nothing more of her than competence and patience. But this morning felt different. The air itself seemed charged with unrest, and the usual morning sounds of Millfield carried an edge that made her pause on the schoolhouse steps. Down the street, a crowd had gathered near the jailhouse, their voices mixing anger with something that sounded too much like hunger. Clara had noticed the prisoner 2 days ago when Sheriff Hawkins and his men dragged him into town. Even from a distance, the man's size was startling. Eli Granger stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and hands that could span a horse's neck. His dark hair hung past his collar, and 3 days of stubble couldn't hide the strong line of his jaw or the quiet dignity in his green eyes. The charges against him were serious cattle rustling from the Morrison Ranch, theft of horses, and resisting arrest. But something about the way he carried himself, even in chains, suggested a man more familiar with honest work than criminal schemes. When Sheriff Hawkins paraded him down Main Street, Eli kept his head high and his expression calm, despite the jeers and thrown rocks from the crowd. "String him up now and save the territory the trouble," old Pete Carlson had shouted from outside the saloon. "Too good for the likes of him," Martha Henderson had added, clutching her shawl tight, as if Eli's very presence threatened her virtue. Clara had watched from her classroom window, disturbed by the mob's eagerness for violence. In her 3 years in Millfield, she'd seen enough of frontier justice to know it often had little to do with actual justice. Men disappeared in the night, bodies were found in ravines, and questions went unasked, as long as the right people stayed safe. Sheriff Hawkins was a thick-set man with pale eyes and a carefully groomed mustache who'd worn his badge for 8 years. He commanded respect through fear rather than honor, and his 3 deputies, Murphy, Collins, and the young one they called Twist, followed his lead without question. Clara had never liked the way Hawkins looked at her, as if her unmarried state made her somehow available for his attention. The sheriff's version of events painted Eli as a drifter who'd been caught red-handed driving stolen cattle toward the border. But the details felt rehearsed, and the witnesses were all men who owed Hawkins favors or feared his disapproval. Most troubling was the speed with which everything moved: arrest, charges, and sentencing all completed within 2 days. Clara opened her mother's Bible, finding the passage about defending the innocent that her mother had underlined in careful script. The pressed violet between those pages still held a faint scent of the Michigan garden where Clara had spent her childhood. Her mother would have spoken up by now, would have asked the hard questions that everyone else seemed content to ignore. The schoolhouse door creaked as Clara pushed it open, breathing in the familiar smells of chalk dust and pine boards. 8 wooden desks sat in neat rows, each one representing a child who depended on her to prepare them for a world that demanded more than most frontier towns offered. She'd taught them reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also something harder to define: the importance of thinking for themselves, of questioning easy answers. Tommy Morrison, whose father owned the cattle Eli supposedly stole, had been one of her best students before dropping out to work the ranch full-time. The boy had a quick mind and a natural skepticism that made him ask uncomfortable questions. Just last month, he'd wondered aloud why his father seemed to have so many more cattle than he'd started with, especially when other ranchers were struggling. "Teacher says we should always ask where things come from," Tommy had mentioned to his father. According to gossip, Clara had overheard at the general store. Within a week, Tommy was pulled from school permanently. Clara set her mother's Bible on her desk and began preparing the day's lessons, but her mind kept drifting to the prisoner. Last evening, she'd walked past the jailhouse on her way to supper and heard Deputy Murphy bragging to his friends about the journey to Yuma prison. 3 days through Apache country with that giant in chains, Murphy had slurred, whiskey heavy on his breath. "Lot of things can happen to a prisoner on a long ride like that. Man could try to escape, force us to defend ourselves." His companions had laughed, understanding the implication. Eli Granger would never reach Yuma alive. Clara had hurried past, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fury. She'd seen enough of the world to recognize murder dressed up as duty, and the casual way Murphy discussed it made her stomach turn. But what could a schoolteacher do against armed men who represented the law? The morning passed slowly, each child arriving with stories of the excitement in town. 7-year-old Beth Stevens could barely contain herself. "Ma says they're taking the bad man away today," she announced to the class. "Says good riddance to bad rubbish." "What makes someone bad, Beth?" Clara asked gently. The little girl frowned, considering. "Well, he stole things. That's what Ma said." "And how do we know he stole things?" "The sheriff said so." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "And sheriffs are always right?" An uncomfortable silence settled over the classroom. Even the youngest children had heard stories of Sheriff Hawkins' methods, of confessions extracted through means no one discussed openly. "Teacher!" 10-year-old Samuel Chen raised his hand, his young face serious beyond his years. "My pa says sometimes people get blamed for things they didn't do. Says it happens to folks who don't have friends in the right places." Samuel's father ran the laundry and had experienced his share of prejudice in a town where differences were viewed with suspicion. The boy had learned early that justice wasn't always blind. "That's a wise observation, Samuel," Clara said. "What do you think we should do when we see someone being treated unfairly?" The children exchanged glances, sensing the weight behind her question. Finally, Beth raised her hand tentatively. "Help them. Even if it's dangerous?" Another pause. Then Samuel spoke up again. "Ma says doing right is more important than doing safe." Clara smiled, feeling a surge of pride in her students and their parents, who'd raised them to think beyond simple answers. These children understood something many adults had forgotten, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite it. As the school day ended and the last child disappeared down the dusty road toward home, Clara remained at her desk, staring at her mother's Bible. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the Michigan sunsets of her childhood. Her mother had been a teacher too, in the days before Clara's father died and left them struggling to survive on a widow's pension. Margaret Mayfield had possessed an unshakable moral compass that guided every decision, every word of advice she'd given her daughter. "Clara," she'd said during her final illness, her voice weak but her eyes still bright with conviction. "Promise me you'll never let fear keep you from doing what's right. The world needs people willing to stand up, even when they're standing alone." Clara had made that promise, though she'd never imagined it would be tested in such a stark way. The sound of wagon wheels and jingling harness drew her attention to the window. Sheriff Hawkins and his deputies were loading their prisoner for the journey to Yuma. Eli Granger, still shackled at wrists and ankles, moved with careful dignity as they helped him into the back of the reinforced wagon. Even bound and surrounded by armed men, he seemed more noble than his captors. As the wagon passed the schoolhouse, Eli turned his head toward the window where Clara stood. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. She saw no plea for help in his gaze, no desperate appeal for intervention. Instead, she saw acceptance, the quiet resignation of a man who'd made peace with an unjust fate. That look broke something inside her, some last barrier between the safe, predictable life she'd built and the dangerous path her conscience demanded she walk. Clara closed her mother's Bible with trembling hands, pressing it to her heart one more time. When she opened it again, it was to the page her mother had marked with the pressed violet, the one that spoke of defending the innocent and standing against oppression. She had a choice to make, and the window for making it was closing fast. Outside, the sun continued its relentless descent, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled a wild, lonesome sound that seemed to echo the cry of her own heart. Clara waited until full darkness settled over Millfield before making her move. The town had gone quiet except for the distant sounds from Murphy's saloon, where Deputy Murphy and his friends were celebrating their upcoming journey with increasing volume and decreasing caution. She'd spent the evening hours in careful preparation, gathering supplies with the methodical precision her mother had taught her. A small satchel held hardtack, dried beef, and a water skin. Her father's old Colt revolver, cleaned and loaded, rested heavy in her coat pocket alongside a handful of extra cartridges. She'd borrowed Mrs. Henderson's mare from the livery stable, leaving a note explaining she'd needed to visit a sick friend in the next county, a lie that sat uncomfortably in her throat but served its purpose. The most difficult part had been deciding what to bring and what to leave behind. In the end, she'd taken only her mother's Bible, the small bundle of her father's letters from the war, and the cameo brooch that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything else, her teaching certificates, her books, her carefully saved money, remained in her room above the general store, silent witnesses to a life she was walking away from. Clara had never stolen anything in her 28 years, had never broken a law more serious than arriving late to church. But as she guided the borrowed horse through the alley behind the jailhouse, she felt a strange calm settle over her. This wasn't theft or lawlessness, this was justice in a place where justice had been corrupted beyond recognition. The jailhouse sat apart from the main buildings, a squat structure of timber and stone with barred windows that looked out on nothing but empty prairie. Sheriff Hawkins had gone home to his wife, confident that his prisoner was secure and his deputies were capable of handling one shackled man. Clara tied the mare to a hitching post behind the building and approached on foot, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the packed earth. Through the single window, she could see Deputy Collins slouched in a chair, his hat pulled low over his eyes and a bottle of whiskey within easy reach. The young deputy they called Twist was nowhere to be seen, probably passed out in the back room after an evening of trying to keep pace with older, more experienced drinkers. The keys hung on a peg beside Collins's chair, close enough to touch if she could get inside without waking him. Clara studied the building's construction, noting the loose board near the back window that she'd observed during her afternoon reconnaissance. It would be tight, but she thought she could manage it. Getting inside proved easier than she'd expected. The loose board gave way with minimal noise, creating a gap just wide enough for her to squeeze through. Collins never stirred, his breathing deep and regular with the rhythm of whiskey-induced sleep. Clara's heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire town, but she forced herself to move slowly, deliberately. She lifted the keys from their peg with fingers that trembled only slightly, then made her way to the cell block. Eli Granger sat on the narrow cot, his back against the stone wall and his eyes open despite the late hour. The moonlight streaming through the barred window caught the metal of his shackles, making them gleam like silver bracelets in the darkness. "Miss Mayfield," he said quietly, his voice carrying no surprise at her presence. "I wondered if you might come." Clara fumbled with the keys, trying each one in the cell lock, with hands that suddenly seemed clumsy and unreliable. "We don't have much time," she whispered. "Collins is drunk, but he won't stay asleep forever." "Why are you doing this?" Eli asked, as the lock finally clicked open. Clara paused, meeting his eyes in the dim light. "Because it's right," she said simply. "Because my mother taught me that sometimes doing right is more important than doing safe." Eli studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Your mother was a wise woman." The shackles proved more challenging than the cell lock. They were heavier than Clara had expected, requiring a different key and more precise manipulation. As she worked, Eli held perfectly still, though she could sense the tension in his massive frame. "There!" she breathed as the iron cuffs fell away from his wrists. "Can you ride?" "Better than most," Eli said, rubbing the raw marks the shackles had left on his skin. "But Miss Mayfield, Clara, once we leave here, there's no going back. They'll hunt us both." Clara nodded, surprised by how little the prospect frightened her. "I know." They made their way out through the same window Clara had used to enter, Eli's sighs making the passage more difficult but not impossible. Deputy Collins remained unconscious in his chair, the empty bottle now resting on the floor beside him. Outside, Clara untied the mare and handed Eli the reins. "Can you ride bareback?" "Done it plenty," he assured her, swinging up onto the horse's back with an ease that spoke of long familiarity with such necessities. Clara climbed up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist to maintain her balance. Even through his shirt, she could feel the solid strength of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Which way?" he asked. "North," Clara said. "There's an old homestead about 5 miles out. We can rest there and plan our next move." They rode in silence through the moonlit countryside, the mare's hooves muffled by the thick prairie grass. Behind them, Millfield slept on, unaware that its quiet schoolteacher had just committed the most daring act of rebellion in the town's brief history. It wasn't until they were well clear of the settlement that Eli spoke again. "I need you to know," he said, his voice carrying over the gentle sound of the horse's movement. "I didn't steal those cattle." "I know," Clara replied. "How?" Clara was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "Because I've been watching this town for 3 years. I've seen how Sheriff Hawkins operates, how convenient it is when problems disappear in the night. And because—" she paused, then continued more quietly, "because I've learned to recognize an honest man when I see one." Eli's hand briefly covered hers, where it rested against his ribs. "Thank you for believing in me." The old homestead appeared as a dark smudge against the horizon, its abandoned buildings silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The family that had tried to make a life here had given up 2 winters ago, defeated by drought, grasshoppers, and the isolation that broke as many spirits as the harsh weather. They approached carefully, alert for signs that someone else might have claimed the shelter, but the place felt empty, haunted only by the ghosts of broken dreams and abandoned hopes. Eli helped Clara down from the horse, his hands gentle, despite their size. "We should rest here until morning," he said. "The mare needs water and feed, and we need to plan where we're going." Clara nodded, suddenly aware of how much her life had changed in the space of a few hours. This morning she'd been a respectable schoolteacher with a predictable future. Now she was a fugitive, bound to a man she barely knew by an act of conscience that had burned all her bridges behind her. Inside the abandoned cabin, Eli found the stub of a candle and lit it with a match from his pocket. The flickering light revealed a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and little else. Whoever had lived here had taken everything of value when they left. "Clara," Eli said, settling on the floor across from where she sat on a wooden crate. "I need to tell you something." She waited, watching the candlelight play across his weathered features. Eli reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a tarnished silver pocket watch. "This belonged to my father," he said, opening it to reveal not just a clock face, but a small compartment behind it. He wasn't just a rancher, he was a federal agent, working to expose corruption in territorial governments. Clara leaned forward, studying the watch in the candlelight. Inside the hidden compartment, she could see tiny scrolls of paper covered in minute handwriting. "Sheriff Hawkins killed him for it," Eli continued, his voice steady but his eyes hard as flint. "Made it look like a riding accident, but I knew better. I came to Millfield to find proof, to finish what my father started, and they framed you for cattle rustling to stop you. Among other things." Eli closed the watch and returned it to his pocket. "Those cattle, they say, I stole. Hawkins and his men have been running them across the border for months, selling them to buyers in Mexico. My father documented it all before they killed him." Clara felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place in her mind. The Morrison Ranch. Tommy Morrison asked too many questions about where his father's extra cattle came from. "Young Tommy's sharper than his father gives him credit for," Eli agreed. The boy noticed discrepancies in the herd counts, started asking questions that made certain people nervous. So they pulled him out of school. And when I started asking the same questions, they decided to eliminate the problem permanently. Clara stared at the candle flame, processing everything Eli had told her. "Your father's evidence, is it enough to expose them?" "It was 4 years ago, but Hawkins has been careful since then, covering his tracks better." Eli met her eyes across the small space. "That's why I need to get back to town, Clara, to find the current records, the proof of what they're doing now." "That's suicide," Clara said flatly. "They'll kill you the moment you show your face." "Maybe, but running won't solve anything. Hawkins will keep stealing, keep killing anyone who threatens his operation. More innocent people will suffer." Clara thought of her students, of Tommy Morrison's quick mind and natural curiosity. How long before other children learned not to ask uncomfortable questions? How long before the entire territory was shaped by fear rather than justice? "Then we don't run," she said quietly. Eli raised an eyebrow. "We? You freed me too, Eli," Clara said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "From a life of watching injustice and doing nothing about it. If we're going to fight, we fight together." Outside the abandoned cabin, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of dawn and the challenges that would come with it. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the harsh reality of their situation. Clara woke to find Eli already up, standing watch at the cabin's single window. The pocket watch in his hand caught the morning light, and she realized he'd been studying his father's hidden evidence by the pale illumination. "How long have you been awake?" she asked, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping on the hard floor. "Couple hours," Eli replied without turning from the window. "Riders passed by twice in the night. Hawkins has men searching, but they're staying to the main trails for now." Clara rose and joined him at the window, acutely aware of how close they stood in the small space. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and empty under the morning sky. Somewhere out there, armed men were hunting them with orders that probably didn't include bringing them back alive. "Let me see your wrists," she said, noticing the way Eli favored his left hand. He held out his arms reluctantly, revealing angry red welts where the iron shackles had chafed the skin raw. In some places, the metal had cut deep enough to draw blood. "This needs tending," Clara said, tearing strips from her petticoat to make bandages. She'd left her teaching slate behind when they fled such a small thing, but it represented everything familiar she'd abandoned for this uncertain path. As she cleaned and wrapped his wounds, Eli remained perfectly still, though she could sense his discomfort. His hands were large and calloused from hard work, but there was a gentleness in them that contradicted his intimidating size. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly as she worked. "The bandages, any of it. You could still go back. Tell them I forced you to help me escape. Hawkins would believe it might even make you a hero for surviving the terrible ordeal." Clara paused in her ministrations, meeting his eyes. "Is that what you think of me? That I'd save myself by lying? I think you're a good woman who deserves better than running from the law with a man she barely knows." "And I think you're a man worth saving," Clara replied, returning to her work on his wrists. "My mother always said you could judge a person's character by how they treated those weaker than themselves. Last night, you could have overpowered me, taken the horse, and left me behind. You didn't. The thought never crossed my mind." "Exactly." Clara finished tying off the last bandage. "That tells me everything I need to know about your character." They shared a breakfast of hardtack and water, their conversation turning to practical matters. The mare needed rest and better feed than the sparse grass around the homestead could provide. They needed supplies, fresh clothes, and information about how extensive the search had become. "There's a trading post about 10 miles north," Eli said, consulting his mental map of the territory. "Run by a half-breed named Joe Crowfeather. He's no friend to territorial authority, might be willing to help. Can we trust him?" "Trust is a luxury we can't afford," Eli replied, "but Joe hates Sheriff Hawkins more than most. That might be enough." They prepared to leave. As the sun climbed higher, Clara acutely aware that every moment they delayed increased the chances of discovery. But before they mounted the mare, Eli stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Clara, I need you to understand what we're facing. Hawkins isn't just a corrupt sheriff, he's part of something bigger. The cattle rustling is just one piece of a network that reaches all the way to the territorial capital. When my father started investigating, he uncovered connections to judges, federal appointments, land deals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." Clara felt a chill despite the warming morning air. "How many people are involved?" "Enough to make us very dangerous to them," Eli said grimly. "And dangerous people don't hesitate to eliminate threats. Then why are you so determined to fight them? Why not just disappear, start over somewhere else?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes distant with memory. "Because my father died, believing that good people would continue his work. Because every day Hawkins stays in power, more innocent folks suffer. And because," he looked directly at her, "because running away never solved anything worth solving." Clara nodded, understanding more than she wanted to about the weight of moral obligation. "Then we'd better make sure we do this right." The ride to Joe Crowfeather's trading post took them through rough country, following game trails and creek beds to avoid the main roads where Hawkins' men might be waiting. The mare, though tired, proved sure-footed and reliable, picking her way carefully through the broken terrain. Clara found herself studying Eli as they rode, noting the easy way he sat a horse and his constant awareness of their surroundings. He pointed out landmarks, warned her of prairie dog holes that could lame their mount, and twice guided them away from areas where he'd spotted distant dust clouds that might indicate other riders. "You know this country well," she observed. "Lived here most of my life," Eli replied. "My father's ranch was about 40 miles east of Millfield, good grazing land, plenty of water. After he died, Hawkins' friends made sure I couldn't prove ownership. Legal papers have a way of disappearing when the right people want them gone. So you lost everything. Everything except the truth about what happened." Eli's voice carried no self-pity, only quiet determination. Sometimes that's enough to build on. The trading post appeared in the distance as a cluster of low buildings beside a creek lined with cottonwood trees. Smoke rose from a chimney, and Clara could see horses in a corral behind the main structure. It looked peaceful enough, but she noticed how Eli's hand moved closer to his gun as they approached. "Let me do the talking," he said quietly. Joe's got his own way of doing things, and strangers make him nervous. They dismounted at the edge of the creek, letting the mare drink while Eli called out a greeting in what Clara assumed was the local tribal language. After a moment, a man emerged from the main building, medium height, dark-skinned, wearing a mixture of traditional and white man's clothing that somehow looked perfectly natural on him. Joe Crowfeather studied them both with intelligent dark eyes before responding to Eli in the same language. The conversation continued for several minutes, during which Clara caught her name mentioned several times, along with what sounded like questions about their circumstances. Finally, Joe switched to English. "You picked a hell of a time to visit, Eli Granger. Half the territory's looking for you and the school mom. We need supplies, Joe, and information." "Information I got plenty of," Joe said, his expression grim. "Supplies might cost you more than you're willing to pay." Clara stepped forward, her mother's Bible still clutched in her hands. "Mr. Crowfeather, I know we're strangers to you, but we're trying to do something right in a world that's forgotten what right looks like. If you can help us, we'd be grateful. If you can't, we understand." Joe studied her for a long moment, his eyes taking in the worn Bible, her determined expression, and the way she stood slightly in front of Eli, despite being half his size. "Ma'am," he said finally, "any woman brave enough to bust a man out of Hawkins' jail and foolish enough to stick with him afterward deserves whatever help I can provide." Relief flooded through Clara as Joe gestured toward his trading post, but even as they followed him inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were only beginning. Joe Crowfeather's trading post proved to be larger and better stocked than Clara had expected. The main room held everything from ammunition and saddles to bolts of cloth and tinned goods, while the walls displayed wanted posters that told the story of the territory's ongoing struggles with law and order. "Yours went up this morning," Joe said, pointing to a freshly posted notice that offered $500 for Eli Granger, dead or alive, and $200 for Clara Mayfield as an accomplice to escape. Clara stared at her own face, rendered in crude sketch form, the artist having captured something stern and unfamiliar in her expression. "I look like a criminal," she murmured. "You look like someone who's decided to fight back," Eli corrected gently. Joe poured coffee from a pot that had been simmering on his stove, the rich aroma filling the trading post with warmth and comfort. "Hawkins sent riders out before dawn," he reported. "They're checking every ranch, every homestead, every place a fugitive might seek shelter. Man's angry enough to chew nails and spit rust." "What about his story?" Clara asked. "What's he telling people about why we ran?" "Claims you were sweet on the prisoner, helped him escape for romantic reasons," Joe said with a slight smile. "Townsfolk are having a hard time believing their prim schoolteacher turned outlaw for love, but Hawkins is selling it hard." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Eli asked quietly, his green eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. Joe cleared his throat diplomatically. "Point is, he's trying to make this about passion instead of justice. Easier to explain, less likely to make people ask uncomfortable questions about why a respected teacher would risk everything to help a supposed cattle thief." "Speaking of cattle thieves," Eli said, pulling out his father's pocket watch, "I need to show you something, Joe." Clara watched as Eli opened the hidden compartment, revealing the tiny scrolls of paper covered in his father's meticulous handwriting. Joe examined them with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. "Your pa was thorough," Joe said after several minutes of study. "Names, dates, herd counts, sale prices. This is enough to hang Hawkins and half his crew." "Was enough," Eli corrected. "Most of this is 4 years old. We need current evidence to make it stick." Joe nodded slowly. "That's going to mean getting close to their operation. Real close." "I know. You realize they'll kill you both the moment they get the chance? This ain't about law and order anymore. It's about survival. Hawkins can't afford to let either of you live to testify." Clara set down her coffee cup with steady hands. "Then we'd better make sure we get the evidence before they get us." Both men looked at her with expressions of surprise and something that might have been admiration. "Ma'am," Joe said carefully, "you understand what you're saying? These aren't schoolyard bullies we're talking about. Hawkins and his men have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again." "I understand," Clara replied, "but I've spent 3 years watching good people suffer while bad people prosper. I won't spend another 3 years doing nothing about it." Joe studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. Here's what I know about Hawkins' current operations." He spread a hand-drawn map across his counter, pointing to various locations marked in different colored inks. "They're running cattle through 3 main routes, depending on where they steal them from. Northern herds go through Devil's Canyon, central ones through Broken Mesa, and southern stock follows the old Apache Trail through Skull Creek." "When's the next shipment?" Eli asked. "Tomorrow night, if my sources are right. Big one, maybe 200 head stolen from the Broken Arrow Ranch. They'll drive them through Broken Mesa to the border crossing at Piedras Negras." Clara traced the route with her finger, noting how it passed within a few miles of several established ranches. "Why hasn't anyone noticed the traffic?" "Because anyone who might notice has either been bought off, scared off, or buried," Joe said bluntly. "Hawkins has been very thorough about eliminating inconvenient witnesses. Like my father," Eli said grimly. "Like your father," Joe agreed, "but he made one mistake. He kept records, detailed records. And if I'm right about where he hides them, we might be able to get our hands on the current books." Eli leaned forward intently. "Where?" "Hawkins has a private office above Murphy's Saloon. Not his official sheriff's office. This is where he conducts his other business. Joe's sources say he keeps ledgers there, correspondence with his buyers in Mexico, even daguerreotypes of some of his more prominent partners." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "How do we get in?" "That's the complicated part," Joe admitted. "The building's watched, guarded, and Hawkins himself lives in rooms just down the hall. Plus, after last night's escape, security's going to be tighter than a miser's purse strings." "But not impossible," Eli said, his mind already working on the problem. "Not impossible," Joe agreed, "but damn close to it." They spent the next hour examining the map and discussing possibilities, Joe providing detailed information about guard rotations, building layouts, and potential escape routes. Clara found herself drawn into the planning with an intensity that surprised her. The methodical approach reminded her of preparing lesson plans, breaking down complex problems into manageable steps. "There's something else," Joe said as the afternoon light began to fade. "Word is, Hawkins has sent for help from his partners in the territorial capital, professional men, the kind who solve problems permanently." "Bounty hunters?" Clara asked. "Worse. Government assassins, men who make people disappear so completely that even asking questions about them becomes dangerous." Eli absorbed this information with the calm of someone who'd expected as much. "How long before they arrive?" "Day or 2 at most, which means if you're going to make a move, it needs to be soon." Clara felt the weight of decision settling over them like a heavy blanket. They could run, disappear into the vast wilderness of the territory and hope to stay hidden long enough for the search to die down. Or they could fight, risking everything on the chance that they could gather enough evidence to expose Hawkins' operation. "There's one more thing you should know," Joe said quietly, "about why this matters so much." He walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the trading post and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside were letters, documents, and what appeared to be a child's drawing. "My daughter attended school in Millfield 2 years ago," Joe said, his voice carefully controlled. "She was 8 years old, bright as a new penny, curious about everything. Started asking questions about why some families in town seemed to have so much more than others, why certain men always had money when honest ranchers were struggling." Clara felt her breath catch, understanding already where this story was leading. "One night, she didn't come home from school. We found her body 3 days later, down by the creek. Official cause of death was accidental drowning, but 8-year-old children don't accidentally drown in 2 feet of water. The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief and anger. Hawkins killed your daughter because she asked questions. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. Hawkins or one of his men. Same difference. Joe carefully rewrapped the bundle, his hands trembling slightly. So, you see, this isn't just about cattle rustling or corruption. This is about children who'll never grow up to ask uncomfortable questions about the world they live in. Clara thought of her students, of Tommy Morrison and Samuel Chen, and all the other bright young minds she'd tried to nurture and protect. How many of them would suffer if Hawkins' reign of terror continued unchecked? Then we don't run, she said firmly. We finish what your daughter started. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red that looked too much like blood. Tomorrow night, they would either strike a blow for justice or join the growing list of people who died trying to stand up to corruption. Either way, Clara thought as she watched the last light fade from the sky, there was no going back to the safe, quiet life she'd left behind. That evening, as they prepared to leave Joe's trading post under cover of darkness, Clara found herself fingering the simple gold band that had belonged to her mother. The wedding ring was the only piece of jewelry Margaret Mayfield had owned, a symbol of a love that had endured poverty, war, and ultimately death itself. Clara had worn it on a chain around her neck since her mother's passing, never imagining she might one day have reason to wear it as it was intended. "You're thinking hard about something," Eli observed as he checked the loads in his rifle. Clara looked up, startled from her reverie. "Just remembering my mother. She used to say that love wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice you made every day, especially when times got difficult. Sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. She chose to love my father even when he came back from the war changed, broken in ways that never quite healed. She chose to love me even when I disappointed her with my stubbornness and independence. Eli paused in his preparations, studying her face in the lamplight. "She'd be proud of what you're doing now." "Would she?" Clara asked, genuine uncertainty in her voice. "I've broken the law, abandoned my responsibilities, put innocent people at risk. Sometimes I wonder if this is courage or just reckless foolishness." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Eli replied gently. "The difference is in why you're willing to take the risk." Joe approached with a bundle of supplies, food, ammunition, and clothing that would help them blend in should they need to enter town. "You two ready for this? Once you leave here, you're committed to the path." Clara slipped her mother's ring back beneath her shirt and stood. "We're ready." The ride to Jake Morrison's ranch took them through country that grew increasingly familiar to Eli as they traveled east. He'd spent his childhood exploring these hills and valleys, learning the land from his father and the Lakota elders who'd shared their knowledge freely with anyone willing to listen respectfully. "There," Eli pointed to a distant light flickering in a valley below them. "Jake's place. Can we trust him?" Clara asked as they began their descent. "Jake was my father's best friend. If anyone's going to help us, it'll be him." But when they approached the ranch house, they found Jake Morrison standing on his porch with a shotgun in his hands and suspicion written across his weathered features. "That's close enough," Jake called out when they were still 30 yards away. "State your business." "Jake, it's me, Eli Granger," Eli replied, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I can see who you are. Question is, what are you doing here when half the territory's hunting you for cattle rustling?" Clara felt Eli's tension, the careful way he kept his voice calm and respectful. "Because you know me, Jake. You know I'm not a thief." Jake was quiet for a long moment, the shotgun never wavering. Finally, he lowered the weapon slightly. "Light down and come up to the porch, but keep your hands where I can see them." They dismounted and approached slowly, Clara staying close to Eli's side. Jake Morrison was a man in his 50s, grey-haired and lean from years of hard work, with eyes that had seen enough of the world to be wary of easy answers. "This the school teacher?" Jake asked, his gaze settling on Clara. "Clara Mayfield," she said, extending her hand. "I've taught your son Tommy." Jake's expression softened slightly. "Tommy speaks well of you, ma'am. Says you made him think about things in new ways. Tommy's a bright boy with a good heart. You should be proud. I am. Jake studied them both carefully. Now, suppose you tell me why you're here instead of halfway to Mexico, like any sensible fugitive would be. Eli pulled out his father's pocket watch, opening it to reveal the hidden compartment. Because we're not running from the truth, Jake. We're trying to prove it. Jake examined the documents with the same careful attention Joe Crowfeather had shown, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, he breathed. Ben was gathering evidence on all of this? For months before they killed him, Eli confirmed. But we need current proof, Jake. Something that will show Hawkins is still running stolen cattle. He is, Jake said without hesitation. Lost 50 head myself last month. Reported it to the sheriff, of course, but somehow the trail always goes cold before Hawkins gets around to following it. Because he's the one stealing them, Clara said. I figured as much, but knowing something and proving it are two different things. Jake gestured toward the house. Come inside, we need to talk. The Morrison ranch house was comfortable without being fancy, filled with the accumulated possessions of a family that had worked hard for everything they owned. Tommy Morrison sat at the kitchen table, looking up with surprise and something that might have been excitement when he saw his former teacher. Miss Mayfield, what are you doing here? Tommy, his father said sharply, go check on the horses. But Pa, now, son. Tommy left reluctantly, casting curious glances over his shoulder. Clara felt a pang of sadness, knowing that her presence here had just made Jake's family part of the danger they carried with them. Jake, she said quietly, we shouldn't have come here. We're putting you and Tommy at risk. Maybe, Jake agreed, but some risks are worth taking. Ben Granger was my friend, and I owe it to his memory to help his son. Besides, he added with a slight smile, Tommy's been asking questions about those extra cattle for weeks. Boy's got a sharp eye and a sharper mind, too sharp for his own good, Eli said grimly. That's what has me worried, Jake admitted. Yesterday, Hawkins paid me a visit, very polite, very friendly. Suggested it might be better for everyone if Tommy stayed home from now on, helped out around the ranch, instead of filling his head with book learning. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. He threatened Tommy? Not in so many words. But the message was clear enough. They spent the next hour planning their approach to Hawkins' private office above Murphy's saloon. Jake provided detailed information about the building's layout, having delivered supplies there in the past. The office was accessible through a rear stairway, but it was watched by guards who rotated every 4 hours. Best time would be during the shift change, Jake suggested. 15 minutes when the old guard's gone and the new one hasn't settled in yet. That's not much time, Clara observed. The return journey to Millfield took them through country that had grown increasingly hostile with each passing hour. Federal marshals, bounty hunters, and Hawkins' own men were all searching for them now, making travel dangerous even under cover of darkness. Clara found herself grateful for Eli's knowledge of the land, his ability to find paths through terrain that seemed impassable to her inexperienced eye. They reached the outskirts of town just before midnight, taking shelter in an abandoned mine shaft that overlooked the main street. From their vantage point, they could see Murphy's saloon, still busy despite the late hour, with light spilling from its windows and the sound of raucous laughter carrying on the night air. There, Eli pointed to a narrow stairway on the building's north side. That leads to Hawkins' private office. Clara studied the approach, noting the single guard who stood at the base of the stairs, occasionally walking a small circuit around the building's perimeter. He looks alert. They all do. Word's gotten out that we're still in the territory. Hawkins knows we're coming for him. Then maybe we should reconsider this plan. If he's expecting us, that's exactly why we have to do this now. Eli interrupted gently. Every day we wait, he has more time to move or destroy evidence. And every day we wait, more innocent people suffer. Clara nodded, understanding the logic even as fear gnawed at her stomach. She'd never imagined herself capable of the kind of violence that might be necessary tonight, but she'd also never imagined herself capable of breaking a man out of jail or becoming a fugitive from the law. "Eli," she said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." He turned to look at her, his green eyes serious in the moonlight. "If something happens tonight, if we don't both make it out, I want you to know that these last few days have been the most alive I've ever felt. For 28 years, I lived a safe, predictable life, never taking risks, never challenging anyone or anything. You changed that." Eli reached out and touched her face gently, his calloused thumb brushing across her cheek. "Clara, nothing's going to happen to either of us tonight. We're going to get that evidence, expose Hawkins. And then what?" Clara asked, genuinely curious about his vision of their future. "And then we build something together, a life based on truth instead of lies, justice instead of corruption." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something difficult. "Clara, I know this isn't the time or place, but if we survive this, will you marry me?" The question hung in the air between them, unexpected and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Clara felt her heart racing, not from fear this time, but from a joy so intense it almost brought tears to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Eli leaned forward and kissed her then, soft and gentle, and full of promises about the future they might build together. When they broke apart, Clara felt as if something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself and what she wanted from life. "Now," Eli said with a smile that transformed his stern features, "let's go get ourselves some evidence so we can have a proper wedding instead of a funeral." They waited until the guard began his circuit around the building, then moved quickly down the hillside toward the saloon. The approach required crossing open ground that left them exposed, but the darkness provided cover, and the sounds from inside the saloon masked any noise they might make. Clara's heart hammered as they reached the base of the external stairway. Above them, light leaked from beneath the door to Hawkins' office, suggesting the sheriff was inside, despite the late hour. "Change of plans," Eli whispered. "If he's up there, we wait for him to leave." But before they could retreat, the office door opened, and Sheriff Hawkins himself appeared at the top of the stairs, accompanied by two men Clara didn't recognize. Their conversation carried clearly in the still night air. "Federal marshals are closing in," one of the strangers was saying. "Time to clean house and disappear." "I've got 20 years invested in this territory," Hawkins replied, his voice tight with anger. "I'm not running from some schoolmarm and a drifter." "The schoolmarm and drifter have evidence that could hang us all," the second stranger pointed out. "Your father's documents, plus whatever they might have gathered since." Clara felt Eli tense beside her as Hawkins laughed, a sound without humor or warmth. "Ben Granger's evidence died with him, and his son's evidence will die with him too, along with that interfering teacher. I've got men positioned all around town. They won't get within a mile of this office. What about the federal investigation? Marshal Collins is a good man, but he's working within the law. Takes time to build a case, gather witnesses, file proper paperwork. We'll be long gone before he can move against us." The conversation continued, but Clara's attention was caught by movement in the shadows across the street. A figure detached itself from the darkness near the general store, moving with the careful stealth of someone trying not to be seen. "Eli," she whispered urgently, "someone's coming." He followed her gaze and immediately tensed. "Bounty hunter, most likely. They've got us surrounded." The trap was closing from multiple directions. More shadows moved in the alley beside the saloon, and Clara could see the glint of moonlight on rifle barrels positioned on the rooftops around the town square. "We need to leave," Eli said quietly. "Now." But as they began to retreat, a voice called out from the darkness behind them. "That's far enough, Granger." They turned to find Deputy Murphy emerging from behind a nearby building, his gun drawn and pointed directly at Eli's chest. The deputy's face was flushed with excitement and whiskey, and his hands weren't entirely steady. "Sheriff's been waiting for you to show up," Murphy continued. "Said you were too stupid to stay away, too stubborn to know when you were beaten." "Murphy, Eli said calmly. You know I didn't steal those cattle. You know Hawkins framed me. Don't matter what I know, Murphy replied. Matters what I can prove, and right now I can prove you're a fugitive resisting arrest. Clara watched the deputy's gun hand, noting the slight tremor that suggested nerves or drink, or both. If she could distract him for just a moment. Deputy Murphy, she said, stepping slightly to the side to draw his attention. Do you have children? The question seemed to surprise him. What's that got to do with anything? Just wondering what kind of world you want to leave them. One where good people are murdered for asking questions, or one where justice actually means something. Murphy's eyes flicked between her and Eli, uncertainty creeping into his expression. Lady, you don't know what you're talking about. I know Sheriff Hawkins killed Joe Crowfeather's 8-year-old daughter because she asked too many questions about cattle. I know he's stolen thousands of dollars worth of livestock from honest ranchers, and I know you know it too. That ain't... Murphy's gun hand wavered slightly. You're a decent man, Murphy, Eli added quietly. You don't have to be part of this. For a moment, Clara thought they might have gotten through to him. Murphy's expression softened, and his gun dropped slightly as he wrestled with conscience and duty and fear. Then Sheriff Hawkins' voice cut through the night air like a whip crack. Murphy, what the hell are you waiting for? The deputy's face hardened again, and his gun swung back to cover Eli. Sorry, folks, orders are orders. But Clara had used the distraction to slide her hand into her coat pocket, where her father's old revolver waited. The weight of it felt strange in her hand, but the mechanics were simple enough: point and squeeze. Murphy, she said quietly, drop your gun. The deputy's eyes widened as he saw her weapon, and for a tense moment the three of them stood frozen in a tableau of mutual threat and uncertain resolution. Ma'am, Murphy said carefully, you don't want to do this. No, Clara agreed. I don't, but I will if you force me to. Above them, Hawkins had noticed the confrontation and was shouting orders to his men. Soon the entire town would be converging on their position. Last chance, Murphy, Eli said. Help us expose the truth or be part of the cover-up. Deputy Murphy looked between them one more time, his face a mask of internal struggle. When he finally made his choice, it surprised all of them. Deputy Murphy slowly lowered his gun, his face pale in the moonlight. Jesus, forgive me, he whispered. I can't do this anymore. Before either Clara or Eli could respond, a new voice cut through the tension, calm, authoritative, and completely unexpected. Nobody needs to do anything, they'll regret. All three of them turned to see a man emerging from the shadows near the jail. A man Clara recognized as the federal marshal who'd visited Jake Morrison's ranch. But instead of the hostile pursuit she'd expected, Marshal Collins approached with his hands visible and his weapon holstered. Marshal Collins, Federal Investigation Bureau, he announced quietly. Deputy Murphy, you can holster your weapon. Mr. Granger, Miss Mayfield, I'm not here to arrest you. Clara kept her gun trained on Murphy, uncertain whether this was rescue or another trap. Then why are you here? Because we've been waiting for you to make contact with Hawkins' operation. You've led us to exactly where we needed to be. Eli stepped protectively closer to Clara. What are you talking about? Marshal Collins gestured toward the shadows around the town square, and Clara suddenly realized that the figures she'd taken for bounty hunters were actually federal agents, positioned to observe rather than attack. We've been investigating the territorial corruption ring for 8 months, the marshal explained. Your father's evidence, Mr. Granger, was the starting point, but we needed current proof of ongoing criminal activity. We needed to catch them in the act. You used us as bait, Clara said, understanding flooding through her. Not exactly. When you broke Mr. Granger out of jail, you created an opportunity we couldn't ignore. Hawkins' response to your escape, the manhunt, the increased security, the acceleration of his operations, it's given us everything we need to move against the entire network. Deputy Murphy holstered his weapon with shaking hands. Marshal, I want to cooperate. I want to testify against Hawkins. I'm tired of being part of this. We were hoping you'd come to that conclusion, Deputy. Your inside knowledge will be crucial to dismantling the operation. Above them, the conversation between Hawkins and his associates had grown more heated, their voices carrying clearly in the still night air. Clara could hear them discussing the destruction of evidence, the elimination of witnesses, and plans to flee the territory within hours. "How long have you known about us?" Eli asked. "We've been tracking your movement since you left Joe Crowfeather's trading post." "Joe's been working with us for months. His daughter's death was what convinced him to risk cooperation with federal authorities." Clara felt a mixture of relief and betrayal. "So Joe was never in danger?" "Joe's been in danger every day for the past 6 months," Marshal Collins corrected. "But he insisted on maintaining his cover until we could gather enough evidence to guarantee convictions." "What about the wanted posters? The manhunt?" "All genuine. Hawkins doesn't know about our investigation, and we couldn't risk compromising it by interfering with his response to your escape. We had to let events play out naturally." Eli pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, opening it to reveal the hidden compartment. "You know about this? We suspected your father had hidden evidence, but we'd never been able to locate it. When you started carrying that watch, we hoped that I'd lead you to it," Eli finished grimly. "That you'd use it. Your father was a federal agent, Mr. Granger. Did you know that?" The revelation hit Eli like a physical blow. Clara saw him sway slightly, and she reached out to steady him. "No," Eli said hoarsely. "I thought he was just a rancher." He was both. Benjamin Granger worked undercover for 3 years, documenting the corruption network that stretches from territorial judges all the way to federal appointments in Washington. His death set our investigation back significantly, but his evidence provided the foundation for everything we've accomplished since. Clara felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "The badge," she said suddenly. "There's something else in the watch, isn't there?" Marshal Collins nodded. "Your father's federal badge, along with coded communications that detail the full extent of the network. We need that evidence to complete our case." Eli opened the watch again, and this time he pressed a different mechanism. A second hidden compartment opened, revealing a small silver badge and several additional documents written in a code Clara couldn't decipher. "Agent Benjamin Granger, Federal Investigation Bureau." Marshal Collins read from the badge. "Your father was one of our best men, Eli. He died serving his country and protecting innocent people, and Hawkins killed him for it," Eli said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Hawkins and his associates, but with your father's evidence and what we've gathered independently, we can finally bring them to justice." The conversation above them had suddenly gone quiet, and Clara realized that Hawkins and his companions were no longer visible at the top of the stairs. "They're moving," she said urgently. Marshal Collins spoke quietly into a small device Clara hadn't noticed before, coordinating with his positioned agents. "All units, subjects are mobile. Maintain surveillance, but do not engage until my signal." "What do you need from us?" Clara asked. "We need you to go up to that office and retrieve Hawkins' current records, his ledgers, correspondence, anything that documents ongoing criminal activity. But if we're seen, you won't be. Hawkins and his men are evacuating through the back entrance, expecting to slip away in the confusion. They think they're being pursued by bounty hunters, not federal agents." Eli checked his rifle and started toward the stairs. "How do we know this isn't another trap?" "Because," Marshal Collins said quietly, "your father trusted me to finish what he started. I'm asking you to trust me for the same reason." Clara looked between the two men, weighing options that all seemed dangerous. Finally, she made her decision. "We'll get the records," she said. "But I want your word that when this is over, our names will be cleared completely." "You have it. Both of you will be recognized as federal assets who assisted in exposing a major corruption ring." They climbed the external stairway quickly, Clara's heart racing with each step. The office door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see papers scattered across a large desk, evidence of a hasty evacuation. Inside, the office was more luxurious than anything else in Millfield, with expensive furnishings that spoke of wealth far beyond a sheriff's salary. A large safe stood open in the corner, its contents partially removed, but not entirely emptied. "Here," Eli called from behind the desk, "ledgers going back 2 years." Clara gathered correspondence from various stacks, noting names and addresses that suggested connections throughout the territorial government. "There's enough here to expose dozens of people." "And here's the current shipping schedule," Eli added, holding up a document that detailed cattle movements planned for the next month. Routes, buyers, prices, paid everything Marshal Collins needs to prove ongoing operations. They worked quickly, gathering everything that looked relevant. Clara found herself impressed by the scope of Hawkins' organization. It was far more extensive than even Eli's father had documented. "Clara," Eli said suddenly, his voice strange. She looked up to see him holding a photograph, his face pale in the lamplight. "What is it?" He handed her the image, a daguerreotype, showing a group of men in formal dress, clearly taken at some official function. Among the faces, Clara recognized Sheriff Hawkins, but there were others that made her blood run cold. "That's Territorial Governor Morrison," she said, pointing to a distinguished man at the center of the group. "And that's Federal Judge Patterson," Eli added, indicating another figure. "And if I'm not mistaken, that's Senator Williams from the territorial delegation to Congress." Clara stared at the photograph, understanding finally the true scope of what they were facing. This isn't just about cattle rustling. This is about control of the entire territory. Federal statehood applications, land grants, railroad rights-of-way, Eli said grimly. "With the right people in the right positions, you could steal millions." A sound from the stairway made them both freeze heavy footsteps, moving fast and headed directly for the office. "Time to go," Clara said, gathering the last of the documents. But as they turned toward the door, Sheriff Hawkins appeared in the doorway, his gun drawn and his face twisted with rage. "Going somewhere?" he asked pleasantly. Sheriff Hawkins stepped into the office, his revolver steady despite the fury radiating from every line of his body. Behind him, Clara could see 2 of his deputies blocking the stairway, cutting off their primary escape route. "I have to admit," Hawkins said conversationally, "I'm impressed. Most folks would have taken the hint and disappeared into Mexico by now. But not you two. You just had to keep digging, didn't you?" Eli stood protectively in front of Clara, his own hand hovering near his weapon. "It's over, Hawkins. The federal marshals know everything." "Do they?" Hawkins smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "What exactly do they know? That cattle have been stolen? That's hardly unusual in this territory. That a corrupt sheriff took bribes? Again, not exactly groundbreaking news." Clara clutched the documents they'd gathered, understanding suddenly that Hawkins was more cunning than they'd given him credit for. "You're planning to disappear and let someone else take the blame." "Very good, Miss Mayfield, though I prefer to think of it as strategic repositioning. You see, I've spent years building plausible deniability into every aspect of this operation. Deputy Murphy will make an excellent scapegoat, a weak man who succumbed to temptation and dragged a few others down with him." "Murphy's cooperating with the federal investigation," Eli said. "Murphy's testimony won't survive the night." Hawkins replied matter-of-factly, "Tragic accident during the pursuit of dangerous fugitives. These things happen in law enforcement." Clara felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized the full scope of Hawkins' plan. He wasn't just going to escape, he was going to eliminate every witness who could connect him to the operation. "The documents we've gathered will disappear along with you," Hawkins interrupted. "Amazing how thoroughly evidence can be destroyed by a well-placed fire. Murphy's saloon is old wood, you know, burns fast and hot." The sound of movement outside drew Clara's attention to the window. In the street below, she could see men positioning themselves around the building, but she couldn't tell if they were federal agents or Hawkins's accomplices. "You can't kill all of us," Eli said quietly. "Too many people know the truth now." "Can't I?" Hawkins seemed genuinely amused. "Mr. Granger, you underestimate the scope of this operation. The territorial governor, federal judges, half the territorial legislature, they're all invested in maintaining the current arrangement. Do you really think a few federal marshals are going to bring down an organization with that much political protection? Clara found herself studying Hawkins' face, noting the confidence that went beyond mere bravado. He genuinely believed he was untouchable, protected by a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of territorial and federal government. My father gathered evidence on all of them, Eli said, his hand moving incrementally closer to his gun. Your father was a foolish idealist who died for his principles, Hawkins replied, much like you're about to do. But before he could act on the threat, a new voice cut through the tension from somewhere outside the office. Sheriff Hawkins, this is Federal Marshal Collins. The building is surrounded. Release your hostages and surrender peacefully. Hawkins' confident expression flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. Hostages? I'm conducting official business with 2 fugitives who broke into my office. We have Deputy Murphy's testimony regarding your criminal activities. The marshal's voice continued. We also have documentary evidence of cattle rustling, corruption, and murder. It's over, Hawkins. Deputy Murphy had an unfortunate accident, Hawkins called back. Slipped and hit his head while pursuing fugitives. Very tragic. Clara felt her heart sink, understanding that Murphy was dead and that she and Eli would soon follow. But Eli was studying the office layout with the intensity of a man planning something desperate. The window, he murmured to Clara. Can you make it to the roof? Clara looked at the narrow window that opened onto a small ledge overlooking the alley. It would be a dangerous climb, but possibly their only chance. What about you? I'll be right behind you. But Clara could see in his eyes that he was planning something else, something that would give her a chance to escape while he faced Hawkins alone. No, she whispered, we go together or not at all. Eli's expression softened, and for a moment the danger around them seemed to recede. Clara, you're the bravest woman I've ever known. But nothing, Clara interrupted firmly. You asked me to marry you, Eli Granger. That means we're partners in everything, including this. Hawkins watched their exchange with growing impatience. How touching, but your romantic moment is about to be cut short. Actually, a new voice said from the doorway, I think it's your moment that's about to be cut short. Everyone turned to see a figure silhouetted in the doorway, not one of Hawkins' deputies, but Jake Morrison, holding a rifle with the easy competence of a man who'd used such weapons all his life. Jake, Hawkins said, his voice tight with surprise. What are you doing here? Finishing what should have been finished years ago, Jake replied. See, I've been thinking about my boy Tommy, about the questions he's been asking. Smart boy, my Tommy, too smart for his own good, according to you. Jake, you don't understand the situation. I understand plenty, Jake cut him off. I understand you killed Ben Granger because he was getting too close to the truth. I understand you've been stealing cattle from honest ranchers for years. And I understand you threatened my son because he noticed things you didn't want noticed. Clara saw Hawkins' gun hand tense, preparing to swing toward this new threat. But Jake had anticipated the move, and his rifle was already trained on the sheriff's chest. Don't, Jake said quietly. I've got nothing to lose anymore, Hawkins. You made sure of that when you threatened Tommy. Your son is safe, Hawkins said carefully. No one's going to hurt the boy. Because you're going to be too dead to hurt anyone, Jake replied. Eli, Clara, get out of here. I'll handle this. But before anyone could move, the sound of splintering wood came from the stairway as federal agents forced their way past Hawkins' remaining deputies. Marshal Collins appeared behind Jake, his own weapon drawn. Stand down, Sheriff, the marshal ordered. You're under arrest for cattle rustling, corruption, and murder. On what evidence? Hawkins demanded, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. On the evidence your fugitive friends just gathered from your office, Collins replied, along with testimony from Deputy Murphy, who, by the way, is very much alive and in federal custody. Clara saw the last of Hawkins' composure crack. That's impossible, Murphy's dead. I killed him myself." "No," Collins said quietly. "You killed a federal agent who was posing as Murphy. Deputy Murphy has been in protective custody for the past week, helping us coordinate this operation." The revelation hit Hawkins like a physical blow, and Clara could see him calculating odds that suddenly looked very different. The network he'd counted on for protection was collapsing around him, and the evidence they'd gathered would be enough to bring down everyone involved. "You have one chance," Marshal Collins continued. "Cooperate fully, testify against your associates, and maybe you'll live long enough to see a prison cell instead of a hangman's noose." Hawkins looked around the room, taking in the federal agents, Jake's rifle, and Eli's steady gaze. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll cooperate." But as he moved to lower his weapon, Clara caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, a calculating desperation that suggested he had one last card to play. "Eli!" she shouted, just as Hawkins' gun swung toward her. Time seemed to slow as multiple things happened at once. Eli threw himself between Clara and Hawkins' weapon. Jake's rifle boomed in the confined space. Marshal Collins dove for cover behind the overturned desk. When the gun smoke cleared, Sheriff Hawkins lay motionless on the office floor, Jake's bullet having found its mark. But Eli was down too, blood spreading across his shirt from Hawkins's final shot. "Eli!" Clara dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against the wound in his shoulder. "Stay with me." "I'm all right," Eli said through gritted teeth. "It's just a flesh wound." But Clara could see the pain in his eyes, and the blood seeping between her fingers suggested the injury was more serious than he wanted to admit. Marshal Collins knelt beside them, examining the wound with experienced eyes. "He'll live," he said reassuringly, "but he needs a doctor soon." 3 days later, the final confrontation came not with guns and violence, but in the oak-paneled courtroom of Millfield's newly constructed courthouse. Federal Judge Patterson, the same man Clara had recognized in Hawkins' photograph, had been arrested in the territorial capital, and a new judge had been appointed to oversee the trials that would determine the future of the entire corruption network. Clara sat in the front row of the courtroom, her hand resting on the small Derringer pistol hidden in the folds of her dress. Despite Marshal Collins' assurances that the danger was past, she'd learned not to trust entirely in the protection of others. The little gun had been a gift from Jake Morrison, who'd insisted that a woman who'd shown such courage deserved the means to protect herself. Eli sat beside her, his arm still in a sling, but his color much improved after 3 days of rest and proper medical care. Behind them, the courtroom was packed with townspeople who'd come to witness the final chapter of a story that had shaped their lives for years. At the defendant's table sat not just Sheriff Hawkins, but 3 other men who'd been arrested in coordinated raids across the territory. Deputy Collins, the real one, not the federal marshal, sat with his head down, clearly broken by the realization of how thoroughly he'd been used. Beside him was Frank Morrison, the territorial land commissioner, and Judge Samuel Patterson, who'd been extradited from the capital to face charges in the jurisdiction where most of his crimes had been committed. "All rise," the bailiff announced. "The Honorable Judge Elizabeth Crenshaw presiding." Clara watched as Judge Crenshaw entered the courtroom, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who'd been sent from the federal circuit to ensure that justice would be served without the taint of local politics. Her reputation for fairness and integrity had preceded her, and Clara felt a measure of comfort, knowing that their case would be heard by someone with no connection to the territorial corruption. "Be seated," Judge Crenshaw said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "We're here today to hear testimony in the case of the United States versus Hawkins and others. Charges including cattle rustling, murder, corruption of public officials, and conspiracy against the federal government." The prosecutor, a federal attorney named Williams, who'd traveled from Washington specifically for this case, rose to present the government's opening statement. Clara listened as he outlined the scope of the criminal enterprise, the years of systematic theft and violence, and the network of corruption that had reached the highest levels of territorial government. "The evidence will show," William said, his voice steady and authoritative, "that these defendants participated in a criminal conspiracy that stole hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property, murdered innocent citizens who threatened to expose their activities, and corrupted the very institutions of government that were meant to protect the people of this territory." When Hawkins' attorney rose to respond, Clara was surprised by how weak his defense sounded. The man seemed to know he was fighting a losing battle, offering only token challenges to the mountain of evidence the federal prosecutors had assembled. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense attorney said, "my client acknowledges that mistakes were made, that perhaps some corners were cut in the pursuit of what he believed to be effective law enforcement. But the prosecution would have you believe that Sheriff Hawkins was the mastermind of some vast criminal conspiracy, when in fact he was merely a small-town lawman trying to maintain order in a difficult territory." Clara felt anger rise in her throat at the attorney's attempt to minimize Hawkins' crimes. She thought of Joe Crowfeather's daughter, of Ben Granger, of all the innocent people who died to protect this small-town lawman's criminal enterprise. The first day of testimony focused on the documentary evidence, the ledgers Clara and Eli had retrieved from Hawkins' office, the coded communications from Ben Granger's watch, and the financial records that showed the scope of the cattle rustling operation. Federal accountants testified about the money trail, explaining how stolen cattle had been converted into cash that flowed through a network of banks and businesses controlled by the conspirators. But it was on the second day that the human cost of the crimes became clear. Joe Crowfeather took the stand to testify about his daughter's death, his voice breaking as he described finding her body and knowing that her only crime had been asking too many questions. "She was 8 years old," Joe said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "She wanted to know why some families had so much when others had so little. I told her that was a good question, that smart children ask questions about the world around them." "And what happened after she started asking these questions?" the prosecutor asked gently. "Men came to see me, said maybe I should teach my daughter to mind her own business, that curious children sometimes have accidents." Clara watched the jury as Joe testified, seeing their faces harden with anger and disgust. These were frontier people who understood the dangers of the territory, but they also understood the difference between legitimate danger and cold-blooded murder. When Jake Morrison took the stand to testify about threats against his son Tommy, Clara saw several jury members lean forward with obvious interest. The idea that children had been targeted for asking questions struck at the heart of everything these people believed about protecting the innocent and nurturing the next generation. "My boy's always been curious," Jake said. "Bright as a new penny, always wanting to know how things work, why things are the way they are. When he started noticing discrepancies in our cattle counts, I was proud of him for being observant." "And then what happened?" "Sheriff Hawkins paid me a visit, very polite, very friendly, suggested it might be better if Tommy spent less time in school and more time learning ranch work. Said too much, book learning could be dangerous for a young man." The prosecutor paused to let the implication sink in. "Did you understand this to be a threat against your son?" "I understood it perfectly," Jake replied grimly, "and that's when I knew we had to do something about Hawkins, before more children paid the price for asking the right questions." On the third day of testimony, Clara was called to the witness stand. As she walked to the front of the courtroom, she felt the weight of every eye upon her, the entire community watching to hear her account of the events that had changed everything. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor said. "Clara Mayfield. And what is your occupation, Miss Mayfield?" "I'm a school teacher here in Millfield." Clara caught sight of several of her former students in the gallery, including Tommy Morrison, whose bright eyes were fixed on her with obvious admiration. She thought of all the lessons she'd taught about courage and moral responsibility, never imagining that she would one day be called upon to demonstrate those principles so dramatically. Miss Mayfield, can you tell the court what led you to assist in the escape of the defendant Eli Granger? Clara took a deep breath, her hand unconsciously moving to touch her mother's ring where it hung beneath her dress. I overheard Deputy Murphy and his associates discussing their plans to murder Mr. Granger during the transport to Yuma prison. They were laughing about how they would claim he tried to escape. And what did you do with this information? I couldn't stand by and watch an innocent man be murdered, Clara said firmly. My mother taught me that sometimes doing right is more important than doing safe. The prosecutor guided her through the events of that night, the rescue, the flight into the wilderness, the discovery of Ben Granger's evidence. But it was when he asked about the final confrontation in Hawkins' office that Clara's testimony became most powerful. Sheriff Hawkins told us that the corruption network reached all the way to Washington, Clara said. He seemed to believe that he was protected by people in very high places, that no local investigation could touch him. Did he mention specific names? He referenced the territorial governor, several federal judges, and members of the territorial delegation to Congress. He had photographs showing him with these officials at what appeared to be social or political gatherings. Clara watched as the defense attorney objected to this testimony, but Judge Crenshaw overruled him, noting that the defendant's own statements were admissible evidence. When Eli took the stand, his testimony focused on his father's investigation and the evidence hidden in the pocket watch. The courtroom was completely silent as he opened the watch and displayed the federal badge, explaining how his father had worked undercover for years to document the corruption. Agent Benjamin Granger was murdered because he got too close to the truth, Eli said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words, but he made sure the truth would survive him. The defense's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Hawkins' attorney seemed to understand that the evidence was overwhelming and that his best hope lay in pleading for mercy rather than disputing the facts. But it was when the town bell began to ring during closing arguments that everyone understood the trial's deeper significance. The bell, which had been silent since Hawkins had ordered it removed years before, was being rung by townspeople who saw it as a symbol of their liberation from fear and corruption. Judge Crenshaw allowed the bell to ring for several minutes before calling for order. I believe, she said with a slight smile, that the community is expressing its opinion about these proceedings. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges against all defendants. As the foreman read the verdicts, Clara felt tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. Sheriff William Hawkins, Judge Crenshaw said when the verdicts had been read, you have been found guilty of murder, cattle rustling, corruption of public officials, and conspiracy against the federal government. The court sentences you to death by hanging, sentence to be carried out within 30 days. The other defendants received lengthy prison sentences, with Judge Patterson getting life imprisonment for his role in corrupting the territorial justice system. As the courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, Clara found herself thinking about all the people who'd suffered under Hawkins' reign of terror. Joe Crowfeather's daughter would never see justice in this world, but perhaps her death had not been entirely in vain if it led to the protection of other children. Outside the courthouse, the entire town seemed to be celebrating. People who'd lived in fear for years were finally free to speak openly about what they'd witnessed and endured. Children who'd been taught to keep quiet and avoid asking questions were running through the streets, their laughter echoing off the buildings. It's really over, Clara said to Eli as they stood on the courthouse steps, watching the celebration unfold around them. This part is, Eli agreed, but now comes the harder work, rebuilding a community based on trust instead of fear. Clara nodded, understanding that their real work was just beginning. The corruption had been exposed and punished, but the task of creating something better in its place would require the same kind of courage they'd shown in fighting the criminals. "Are you ready for that kind of work?" she asked. Eli smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. "With you as my partner, I'm ready for anything." As the town bell continued to ring, Clara realized that it wasn't just marking the end of their ordeal, it was announcing the beginning of a new chapter in all their lives. 3 months later, the early October sun cast golden light through the windows of the newly restored church, as Clara adjusted the ivory silk wedding dress that had been sewn by nearly every woman in Millfield. The fabric was simple but elegant, adorned with delicate lacework that told the story of a community coming together to celebrate the woman who had helped free them from years of fear and corruption. Mrs. Henderson, the mayor's wife, stepped back to admire her handiwork as she finished arranging Clara's veil. "My dear, you look absolutely radiant." Clara studied her reflection in the small mirror they'd positioned near the window, hardly recognizing the confident woman who looked back at her. The timid schoolteacher, who had once lived quietly above the general store, was gone, replaced by someone who had discovered her own strength and courage in the crucible of danger and moral choice. "Are you nervous?" asked Sarah Morrison, Jake's wife, as she helped arrange the bouquet of prairie wildflowers that Clara would carry down the aisle. "Not nervous," Clara said thoughtfully. "Excited. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm meant to do." Through the window, she could see the townspeople gathering outside the church, their faces bright with the kind of joy that comes from sharing in something purely good after experiencing so much darkness. Children ran between the adults, their laughter a sound that had become common again in Millfield since the trials had ended. "Clara," Mrs. Henderson said gently, "your mother would be so proud of what you've accomplished." Clara touched the gold ring that now hung openly around her neck, no longer hidden beneath her clothes. Soon, she would wear it on her finger, as her mother had intended. But first, she wanted to carry her mother's blessing with her as she walked toward her new life. "I hope so," Clara replied. "I hope she'd understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is being willing to risk everything for what's right." Outside, the church bell began to ring, the same bell that had announced their victory in the courtroom, now calling the community together for a celebration of hope and new beginnings. Clara had asked specifically that Tommy Morrison be the one to ring it, recognizing that his curiosity and courage had been part of the chain of events that led to their triumph. Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best but smiling broadly. "Ladies, I believe it's time." Clara had asked Jake to walk her down the aisle, honoring the man who had risked everything to help them expose the truth. In the absence of her father, she could think of no one more appropriate to give her away to the man she loved. "Ready?" Jake asked, offering his arm. "Ready," Clara confirmed, accepting his steady support. The church doors opened to reveal a sanctuary packed with people from not just Millfield, but from ranches and settlements throughout the territory. Word of the wedding had spread far beyond the local community, drawing folks who wanted to witness the union of the couple whose courage had changed their lives. As Clara began her walk down the aisle, she saw familiar faces throughout the congregation. Joe Crowfeather sat in the front row, his expression peaceful, despite the sorrow that still marked his features. Deputy Murphy, now serving as acting sheriff while the territory searched for a permanent replacement, nodded respectfully as she passed. Even Federal Marshal Collins had made the journey from the territorial capital to attend the ceremony. But it was the sight of Eli waiting at the altar that made Clara's heart race with pure joy. He stood tall and straight, his left arm no longer in a sling but still bearing the scar from Hawkins' final shot. He wore a simple black suit that emphasized his impressive height and the quiet dignity that had first attracted her attention. When their eyes met across the length of the church, Clara saw her own happiness reflected in his gaze. This man had shown her what real courage looked like, what it meant to stand up for justice, even when the cost seemed too high to bear. Together, they had faced down corruption and violence, and together they would build something beautiful in its place. Reverend Matthews, who had been brought in from the territorial capital to perform the ceremony, began the service with words about love as a choice and marriage as a partnership in serving something greater than oneself. "Dearly beloved," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have already proven their devotion to each other through trial and tribulation." When it came time for the vows, Clara and Eli had chosen to speak words they had written themselves, promises that reflected not just their love for each other, but their commitment to the community they had fought to protect. "Eli," Clara said, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her, "I promise to stand beside you in all things, to face whatever challenges come with the same courage you've shown me. I promise to build with you a life based on truth and justice, and to never forget the lesson you taught me, that sometimes doing right is more important than doing safe." "Clara," Eli replied, his deep voice warm with affection, "I promise to protect and cherish you, to support your dreams and share your burdens. I promise to build with you something worthy of the sacrifices that brought us together, and to honor the memory of those who died so that we might live in freedom." When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, the entire congregation erupted in cheers and applause. But for Clara, the sound faded into background as Eli leaned down to kiss her, sealing their union with the same gentle strength that had sustained them through their darkest hours. Outside the church, the celebration continued well into the evening. Tables had been set up in the town square, loaded with food contributed by families from across the territory. Music and dancing filled the streets, as people who had lived in fear for years finally felt free to celebrate openly. As the sun set over the Dakota Territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara and Eli stood at the edge of the celebration, watching their friends and neighbors enjoy the freedom they had helped secure. "Any regrets?" Eli asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Clara leaned against his solid strength, thinking of the quiet life she had left behind, the safe routine that had once defined her existence. "None at all," she said firmly. "This is exactly the life I was meant to live." Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bright points of light that seemed to promise endless possibilities for the future they would build together.